You unlock this door with the key of compassion. Beyond it is another world, a world of science, a world of common sense, a world of sanity. You're moving into a land of both empathy and ethics, of nutritional knowledge and empowerment. You've just crossed over into Dr. Osborne's zone. Welcome to the Dr. Osborne Zone. I'm here today with Dr. Katiraei. He's a pediatric specialist, and he has a strong background in mold illnesses and mold toxicity with children. And I wanted to pick his brain a little bit today on his experiences, and hopefully he can help enlighten us. And if you've got kids and they're sick or they're struggling, maybe we can shed some light on that. Dr. Katiraei, thanks so much for being here today. I appreciate you.
It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you for bringing this entire educational series and film together, because we need a lot more awareness and a lot more information out there about mold. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Of course. Can you tell us, how did you get interested in mold? It's such an esoteric topic in medicine, and nobody's really covering it. So walk us down that line.
Yeah, I think mold was one of those walls that I just kind of slammed into. And, I had quite a few patients that I just could not make heads or tails of. They had all kinds of weird issues, and most of them were the pans and pandas, kids with lots of intense inflammation, aggression, and like high anxiety. Also kids with, learning disabilities, a handful of kids with autism that just every single trick that I had in my bag just did nothing for them. And, I was just stuck scratching my head, like, what is up with these kids? Like, why do they have these issues? And there was actually a mom of one of these kids who was just this powerful warrior mom that, started digging and doing research. And she was the one that found Dr. Nathan and, connected with him and said, "Hey, I've set up a consult with this guy, Dr. Nathan. He happens to know a bit about mold. You want to talk to him with me?" I'm like, why not? I haven't been able to contribute anything to your kid's success. Let's see if Dr. Nathan has. And Dr. Nathan was the one that opened my eyes. And we presented a case to him of this poor child with extreme aggression and irritability, got kicked out of school, like brilliant kid, lovely kid, but just could not regulate himself, for his life. And Dr. Nathan looked at his labs, and, I had questioned, like, God, I don't think this is mold. Like, everything looks pretty good. And then Nathan heard the case, looked at the labs, he's like, "Oh, this is mold. For sure, this is mold." And, we dug into it, and lo and behold, they had so much mold in their house that literally a mom just left everything, took a handful of clothing and just left the furniture because it was so contaminated that they just literally were told, like, do not touch anything in this house, just get out. And that's what opened my eyes. And early on, so this is like 4 or 5 years ago, my first instinct was, well, oh, wow, this is a problem. Let me find some other person in pediatrics that really understands this stuff, and I'll just use them. And I started looking, and initially was like, okay, let's see if I can find someone in Los Angeles where we're based. And there was no one. Then it's like, oh, how about someone in California? No one. And I started looking, and there were at that time maybe 4 or 5 people in the country that really understood mold. So initially, with a bit of reluctance, I started getting into it and learning from Dr. Nathan, joined his mentorship program, and one thing led to another. And, the more I researched mold and the more I learned about it, and, at a certain point, like obsessively, I was just pulling every article I could find. The more I learned, the more concerned I became. And it just brought me to a place where, literally I was like, oh my God, how much harm is caused to these children and families as a result of mold. And I know why you're here and why all these families are here to listen to this. But as a pediatrician, it's absolutely the most terrifying thing I've ever encountered. And, I've in the past been worried about heavy metals and all kinds of other things. And it's not to dismiss the possibility of those causing harm, but mold to me is the elephant in the room. And is causing more problems to more children than we can probably wrap our heads around.
That's a pretty big statement. I'd like you to just give me your opinion on the scope of, in your opinion, I know we can't draw, the overarching exact numbers, but as far as kids are concerned, I know autism rates are on the rise. PANS and PANDAS rates are on the rise. How much of this do you think is mold? Like, how much would you guess at, or intelligently say, okay, mold contributes to X percent, or can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to reemphasize what you said, we don't know. So we honestly don't have the answer. I can tell you based on my clinical experience and what my mentors have pointed out to me, which I have confirmed in my own practice, is probably, if not close to 50%, upwards or more than 50% of autism may actually be mold toxicity. I can tell you the vast majority of children in my practice that present with PANS and PANDAS ultimately have mold toxicity as the primary factor. So to elaborate on that, right now with PANS and PANDAS, we say, well, strep, mycoplasma, viruses, et cetera, are the trigger for the autoimmune phenomenon. What very few people talk about is why in God's good earth would the child's immune system become so irrational and so incompetent in its response to then start having a reaction to these very, very common things. Like if you check kids for mycoplasma, literally everyone has mycoplasma. If you check kids for CMV, EBV, like at a certain age, most kids have had these viruses. Like these are very common infectious factors that are out there. 30% of kids are colonized, like normally colonized with strep, and you don't even know it. So it was actually Dr. Aristovojdani. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah.
Who's this brilliant immunologist and one of my mentors that early on is like, Pejman, pay a little bit more attention to the immune system that's reacting to these things rather than things themselves. And as I started really looking at this, like molds, and then you add to, other environmental toxins, is the perfect trigger to cause an immune disorientation where essentially you have loss of tolerance, right? And if you look at what happens with mycotoxins and allergies and all kinds of other things, it causes immune intolerance. And then you add to that the immune suppression and immune disability, essentially, that mycotoxins can cause. All of a sudden, manifestations like PANS and PANDAS makes a whole lot more sense. In my experience, the vast majority of severe ADHD, like those poor kids that cannot focus for the life of them, it's this all the time, weird learning disability, severe executive functioning disabilities where these kids just can't actually start a task, changes in short-term memory, which we all kind of attribute to, this garbage can diagnosis of ADHD. A lot of those kids have mold as their underlying factor. And I mean, the list can go on and on, but like those high level, things that we pay attention to in pediatrics, a very large number of them are most likely attributed to mold.
So can I back up there? Because you mentioned earlier, you said some of the other things we look at. And one of the things you mentioned was, and so being a pediatrician, one, it's rare to find a pediatrician who will even admit that there's a correlation or connection between childhood illness and your practice. And I don't know how long you've had a practice where you've looked at that versus where you kind of like with mold 5 years ago, you came into it and got better at it. Was there a point in your practice where maybe you made that same kind of correlation? But from the perspective of to mold, like you say 50% or more, at least in your experience, of children with these neurological illnesses and what are oftentimes being diagnosed as psychiatric illnesses are being exposed to mold. How much of that do you think is combined with versus is your practice mostly children that are more cautious around approaching, parents that are cautious around approaching?
So I would say we have some families that want to do all the and I would never tell them not to. I would say that I do attract families that want an alternative approach. So the way we do it in my practice is our goal is that by the time the kid is ready to start school, like they've had their and they're good to go. I'll give you kind of a, my journey with, if you had talked to me 8 years ago, I would have been a very hardcore physician. And I was 100% on the bandwagon of, oh my God, and the aluminum and adjuvants are causing a horrendous degree of harm. And there are long-term consequences that we probably don't understand. And what was weird, and there's probably one or two posts that I had put, back in the days that are still somewhere where I had expressed these notions. What happened over time is more than a few cases where I was like, oh my God, this is going to cause harm. The child had to get the for X, Y, or Z reasons, and everything was fine. And as time has passed, I became actually more and more relaxed around. And it's not to say they don't cause harm, because as part of my practice, so I do about 50-60% general pediatrics, well kids, and then 30-40% of really complicated consultations. And while I'm really focused on the kids with learning and this learning and behavioral challenges now, I've done a lot of cases of, weird gastrointestinal issues, severe inflammatory bowel disease, autoimmune disease. And, with this, I've done consultations on the kids that were injured, where suddenly they developed type 1 diabetes, suddenly they developed kidney failure, suddenly they developed eczema or, regressive autism or other things. So I'm very, very clear that these things happen. But as time passed, what I asked myself is, of the kids that I was seeing, what was it about them that led them to become injured from these vaccines? And over time, the way I've come to contextualize is that are like matches. They're immunological matches, right? And they're designed to be biologic agents that trigger an immune reaction, which hopefully is beneficial to us, right? That's their purpose. And with matches, if you take matches and you go on an asphalt parking lot, right, you can light 1,000 matches on that asphalt parking lot and nothing happens. You go up into a dry forest with obscene amounts of tinder and you light one match and you cause this horrendous forest fire that will, cause horrific amounts of harm. What we don't understand, and we're not sophisticated enough to understand, is what is the difference between those kids that get and their systems don't even show a blip, right? And I project that 98%, give or take, of the general peds population is that. They've got these systems that are robust. They get the injection from what I've seen. And, with some of these kids in my general peds practice, I've seen them for 7 to 9 years. And fortunately, they've all done great. But what is it about these kids that when they do get it, all of a sudden there's something really odd that happens? And at least in my experience, over the last 4 to 5 years, as I've become more aware, every single child in my practice, and thank God we've only had maybe 5 to 7 of them who've had reactions, every single one of them had mold exposure prior to it. And when you look at certain things, like for instance, regressive autism, right? Kid is okay. When you really talk to these parents, like they weren't totally okay, but they were still kind of talking. They were still kind of making eye contact. They did have some sensory issues. They did have colic early on. Like there are things that were happening with these kids that you couldn't say the kid was totally perfectly healthy, but they certainly weren't, nonverbal autism. And as you look at what were the things that were causing these issues? Right, the severe colic, the early sensory issues, where even at a year of age, every time some kind of loud sound comes, the baby starts crying. Developmental issues, where the kids weren't crawling on time, they had low tone. A lot of these kids have hypotonia and other things. You start getting to a place where you start realizing, and I'm not saying the mycotoxins are the only thing. Chronic Lyme, heavy metals, like large amounts of heavy metals, like Flint, Michigan levels of heavy metals. heavy amounts of glyphosates, like living across from a commercial farm. I'm not talking, the family that doesn't eat all organic. We're talking like wafts of glyphosates washing into your face. My suspicion is that a lot of these children have one or more of these nasty, heavy environmental toxicants that are there, causing a physiological disruption, not just in the immune system, but the microbiome, the gastrointestinal tract, the mitochondria. They're already causing a disruption in even the neurons. And then you throw into that mix, the system is already ready to collapse. And now this is the match that just sets the forest fire ablaze, causing, rather horrendous harm. So this is my hypothesis of why we see these injuries. And I don't think we're sophisticated or smart enough yet to get to a place where we can do that differentiation. But at least in my practice, that this has been the observation and what I've seen in X number of kids that did have some kind of adverse reaction to the.
Do you think that mold is more of a problem today than, let's say, it was 30, 40, 50 years ago? Or do you think it's just technologically we now have tools to recognize it for what it is?
It's really great question. In how I've come to see it, I think it's become a bigger problem. I think we've become smarter in understanding it, so we are more aware of it and picking it up more frequently. But I also believe that it is causing more of a problem now than ever before. And the two things that I've come to understand is we've got the total toxic load that's much higher now than ever in the history of mankind. And in particular, at least in what I've come to see, glyphosates are probably one of the bigger contributing factors, because the more I look at the mycotoxins and what they do pathophysiologically, and then you look at glyphosates, it's weirdly similar. They both disrupt the mitochondria. They both induce intestinal permeability. They cause leaky gut. They disrupt the gut immune system. They disrupt the systemic immune system. Like you can literally take the laundry list and go boop, 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 boop. And it's almost like, even though they're completely different compounds, they have very similar physiological effects. So if you take, the total toxic load that sadly everyone is born with now or has, right? If you're an adult and now you're in your 40s or 50s, and then you look at, well, what kind of vulnerability do these toxins induce, right? If they already erode the capacity and vitality of the system, that would make us more vulnerable to the effects of these mycotoxins. The other factor is, the more I've learned from, some of my brilliant environmental, colleagues, there's this friend of mine, Michael Schrantz. I don't know if you've heard of him. Mike has been a dear mentor of mine, and he's helped me learn so much. I mean, he's one of the smartest environmental guys I know. And one of the things that he helped me see is how our building science and building methods have changed, right? Drywall came into the picture, 50 years ago? 60 years ago. And then along with that, we had the smart idea of just completely sealing off the buildings, right? For the sake of energy efficiency, we've just made homes these closed environments that don't breathe. And that's happened over the last decade, 15 years. Right. 20 years ago, like windows, you look at how windows were, like there was a half-inch gap, you close your window and there's like still that much air. And that's just how homes were. So the change, the air exchange in homes that was present 20 years ago is not now, because we closed the homes and we run the ACs more than ever. And then on top of that, with climate change and how grains and corn and everything are stored in silos, and probably they've become more moldy, so we also have an influx of mold toxins from that. I think it's the perfect combination to cause this epidemic of mold toxicity that we probably were not seeing even 15 years ago or 10 years ago.
So your thought is the building technology changes increase the susceptibility of more mold coming into the homes and being more concentrated in that indoor air environment. Well, a lot like indoor air pollutions and VOCs and other things, right?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, a lot of the building science people, are the ones that really believe this is the case, and that there are a few published studies out there that do clearly demonstrate that because of this, need to create efficiency, we've actually created, more toxicity within the indoor environments.
Have you talked to people where there's a growing concern and a potential solution that's trying to come from that growing concern? So if tighter buildings and seals around buildings are more status quo, are people waking up to the fact that we're creating mold boxes, and subsequently are there ideas coming out of that you've seen or you've heard others talk about, other professionals talk about as a better solution?
Great question. So this is where I would say I and most of the mold community are not seeing eye to eye. So the way I was trained and what is the current mindset in the mold community is, if there's mold contamination, you just need to get all of it out. And really the only way to have safety, if you want to say, is to be in an environment that is essentially free of mold. And I was completely bought into that. And, in my population of families that I care for, where the vast majority of them have, enough money, if mold is detected, it's like, sure, $50,000 remediation, no problem. $100,000 remediation. Yeah, sure. We got to do it because my kid's health depends on it. And I kept following that until I started working with other families, where they didn't have that kind of money. And there were families who were renting, and we found mold, but the landlord is like, oh, they bring in their, inspector off the street who God knows what kind of training they had. And they come in and they literally take one sample from inside the entire house, and they do another sample from the garden. And they say, well, the contamination of the inside of the house is less than the garden. Therefore, there's no mold. And I don't see any like leaks. So therefore there's no mold. And the landlord's like, sorry, there's no mold. You don't like it, leave. And the more I talked to these families, the more I got to a place where, like, well, the solution of sterilizing every home is just not realistic, because that would mean that millions of families couldn't do anything about this. So that's where I started running down other rabbit holes, asking, well, God, like, what is the solution if you can't fix every single home? And, in the dream world, and there's a beautiful foundation called Change the Air Foundation, where these wonderful people that I adore, and I'm part of their board, are working night and day to try to change that. They're trying to change legislation. They're trying to change policy to allow people to have healthier indoor environments. Reality is that's probably a decade or two away before they can change the mindset, similar to, cigarettes, right? What, 10 years ago, light up a cigarette inside a room. What's the big deal, right? You walk into a restaurant, cigarette smoke everywhere, right? Bars, cigarette smoke everywhere. We're finally smart enough to realize that maybe that's not such a good idea. I would say, at least in my perspective, and some people may cringe with this statement, but I think mycotoxins in the damage they cause, they're probably more dangerous than cigarette smoke. And they are probably causing more harm and causing more disease than even cigarette smoke did. And if you look at how we reacted to cigarettes, which I think was a brilliant idea, like, cigarette smoke is not good for anyone, this is probably an even bigger deal, but it's going to take time. So all of that to say, I started looking at, well, what else is available? And right now, we talk about HEPA filters, right? Let's put a HEPA filter in there and have that scrub the air. HEPA filters mechanically are capable of pulling mold toxins out, because mold toxins are large enough where good HEPA filters can pull them out. But the one thing that we don't talk about is how much air do you have to scrub to actually pull these toxins out? Have you gotten into like the weird science of HEPA filters? I don't know if that's something that has come up.
To a smaller extent, probably, than you, but I've looked more at in my clinical experiences, having people use HEPA filtration again, as a sound scientific way to clean the air, make it better, higher quality from an indoor air perspective. But when you get into square footage and the size of the house, there are variances, and different machines have different capabilities. And then there's noise pollution. And then you got somebody who's got 15 of these machines running and they can't sleep at night. And yeah.
You nailed it. That's it. So I found this really brilliant guy. His name is Carl Grimes, insanely smart, and knows more about environmental mold than any person that I had met. Because I asked Carl, I was like, Carl, I have families that have $800, $900 IQ Air Pros in every single room, and these kids are still sick. They're still having issues. Like, what gives? So we started looking at like, okay, well, if you have let's say a living area that's a 20 by, let's say 30 foot with a 15-foot ceiling, that's a lot of cubic feet of air. And let's say you have an IQ Air and you're running it at like a level 3, which is, and with most of those machines, like the sound pollution, right, is one of the things where if you set it too high, it's just this thing is so obscenely loud that no one in their right mind would ever run it at that volume. But one of the things that we started talking about is you would have to scrub an obscene amount of air, meaning you would have to, like in a larger room, you would have to scrub all of that air 10 times over to actually be able to move enough air to scrub the mycotoxins and spores out of it. And just to give you context, like an IQ Air, if we're using that unit as an example, at a level 3, it moves about 200 to 300 cubic feet per minute. In a larger room, if there's mold contamination, enough mold contamination, the likelihood of getting enough air to move pushes us into the 1,000 to 1,500 cubic feet per minute. And if you can imagine the amount of noise, like you'd have to get into like commercial air scrubbers that basically create a, tornado inside your room to be able to move that kind of air. And that's where I had this aha moment of, well, HEPA filters are cool, and there's no question that they can help, but no one in their right mind would use that kind of a device in their home to move and scrub the air, because it's just, you can't live with that much noise. And that's where I started digging into other things. And this is where I've kind of diverged paths with a lot of my colleagues. I started looking at these negative ion generators, these bipolar negative ion generators. And has that ever come up in conversation?
I use them all the time. I recommend
cool.
them all the time. Yeah. So I know, I think I know where you're going, but I'd love to hear your experiences and opinions.
Yeah. So this was a relatively new thing, maybe 6 months ago, that it kind of came up my radar. And Dr. Nathan had this wonderful doctor, Dr. Dennis, who's this brilliant ENT from Texas. And he deals with tons of mold patients. So it was Dr. Dennis that was like, yeah, I've started using this device, negative ion generators. Oh my God, my patients are so much better with it. And my ears perked up. I'm like, what the heck is that, dude? So I started looking into it, and all of a sudden this light bulb went off. So these ion generators, as you know, basically they just spit out a boatload of electrical charge into the environment. And essentially what these electrical charges do is with very fine particulate. So if you look at like things the size of a virus, which is what mycotoxins are, right? They're about 0.1 microns, and mold spores are about 3 microns. So they're bigger, but very, very fine particulate. These electrical charges basically create a electrostatic charge, and then they cause these things to cling to surfaces, which kind of sucks because it doesn't filter it out. But what it does do is it removes it from the actual environment that we're breathing in. And so I started digging into this and finally found this one researcher that was willing to talk to me. His name is Dr. Zhang, and he's out of the University of Manitoba. And it turns out that they had published some papers on these negative ion generators more in the agricultural domain. But it was he, and I found some other articles that did demonstrate, not necessarily with mycotoxins. I mean, the honest answer is we still don't really know if they work, but theoretically, at least, because they do help with viruses, they do help with small particulate, that in theory, we think that they do work. And what I found in my clinical practice is, at least in the last few months that I've really started recommending this, a lot of people that had ongoing issues, allergy reactions, respiratory issues, and then in my Pans and Pandas kids, the nervous system activation because of the immune reaction, sometimes within 2 or 3 weeks of running these devices, all of a sudden things calm down in like dramatic fashion. So it's still something really early. We don't have a lot of data. We don't know if they create some kind of adverse reaction that we're not aware of. But I think that these negative ion generators, as you also wisely said, are probably one thing that can really help a lot of these families that are living in mold and don't know what to do otherwise.
Yeah, we ran into the same problem where, like you said, you have some people that can afford to move, some people that can afford to remediate, and then you have people that can't. And so what's the solution? They can live in a tent in their backyard. They could, buy a mobile home and put it in the driveway. They can go move in with a family member. None of those are really great, viable solutions, from a long-term perspective, and certainly don't solve the core of the issue. But I've had a number of people use these hydroxyl ion generators and find that they can tolerate better the environment. So we kind of come at it from the approach of it's not a remediation device. It's not going to get rid of the mold. It's not going to get rid of the source of why the mold is in your house. But if it reduces the overall burden of your exposure and allows your body to kind of come to better terms in the immune system and the nervous system, then we'll take that as a victory while we're trying to figure the rest out.
Absolutely. 100% on the same boat.
That's interesting because I haven't talked to very many people in the mold world who have come across that. I mean, I actually came across it because I met a woman who was in litigation for her home. Her builder built a home, and it was a relatively new home. So, they found mold, and she got very sick, and her family got very sick, and they couldn't afford to move out. They didn't have any other options. And well, she discovered this technology through her own diligence. And then she bought like 5 of these units to put in her house. And she was able to function again. Like her functionality came back because she was on the couch, not able to do much, but again, it couldn't afford to leave. And so she was referred to me by a mold inspector friend that I have. And so anyway, that was how I learned about them. And, since then, anybody who I've seen that has had a major mold issue where cost, or inhibition of being able to move, or even just, you've seen these probably too, I would imagine, where one person in the house is skeptical, the other one is sick, right? They've been to multiple specialists, experts, doctors. Nobody agrees with the mold diagnosis or the mycotoxicosis diagnosis. And so you have almost like a civil war in the home. And sometimes this is also kind of I wouldn't call it a permanent solution again, but it's a better solution than no solution for a lot of these folks.
You read my mind. I was literally thinking that same exact thought, that there are cases where, there's a little bit of a disagreement. People don't see eye to eye. And, I have one case in particular where one family member, the mom, was very resistant, and the dad and the son were both very sick. And within weeks of using this device, all of a sudden they felt better. And then the mom was more on board of like, okay, God, this thing is probably real. So yeah.
Yeah. What beyond this type of device? So this is something that can be done to possibly at least reduce exposure, reduce symptoms. What other things do you find clinically helpful for your pediatric base on, getting rid of mycotoxins? Do you find that? So this is just my own experience. I found if I try to do a heavy type of detoxification process with someone and they're still in it, that they're reacting poorly, like they have negative response, and they're not really all that greatly capable of doing any kind of massive detoxification process without paying a huge price. What are you doing in those situations? Are you using milder protocols? How are you approaching it?
I'm glad that you brought this up. Part of why I was kind of searching everywhere for something like these negative ion generators is I found that, especially for the kids on the spectrum and, these kids with neuroinflammation, like I couldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole to try to detoxify them when they were in that active flare. Their systems were just too volatile, and it's like walking into a landmine field and just having limbs blow off in I had cases. I mean, it was so ridiculous. Like there was one poor little girl, mold in multiple areas of the home, AC unit, crawl space and some walls. The poor little girl was so inflamed that literally she couldn't wear any clothing. Like, I mean, she couldn't even wear underwear. And the mom would call me on a few occasions crying because she was in the car and her 6-year-old literally was not willing to wear underwear to be able to go to school. And she's like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And I kept running into a scenario where I just looked, I'm like, God, it's not realistic for everyone to say, well, God, I can't help you unless you remediate the hell out of everything in your home. So one of the things that I do believe is really important is mitigating the environment enough where the immune system can calm down, because I do believe that a lot of individuals are essentially borderline allergic to these molds. And I say borderline because it's not a true IgE-mediated allergy. I'm sure you've seen this in a lot of the patients you care for, but it's more between the mast cells and God knows what else. The immune system is very much activated when the exposure is taking place. So what I have found in terms of helping these families is once there's enough, it doesn't have to be perfect, but enough mitigation where the immune system is able to settle down, then I use certain compounds to further calm down the immune system. There's a compound or product called Mirica. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's PEA, and for the life of me, I can never pronunciate what PEA stands for, but it's PDA with luteolin. The luteolin, on top of being a bioflavonoid that has anti-inflammatory properties, actually helps stabilize the mast cells. The PEA is a really cool compound that actually helps downregulate the microglia. So at a neuroinflammatory state, which most of the kids that I take care of present with, that helps kind of settle things down. And then when I combine that with these DAO enzymes, these diamine oxidase enzymes, which we naturally have in our guts, and basically what these things do is just break down histamine. So by calming down the microglia and the inflammation and dropping the histamine levels, a lot of times I'm able to get enough of an inflammatory effect with the environmental control to kind of bring these kids back down to planet Earth. And usually I also do a little bit of metabolic support because a lot of these kids have issues with metabolizing energy, especially with fats. So a combination that I've done is the Mirica, the histamine block, and then just basic carnitine. And the reason for that is a lot of times when metabolism's off, the adrenal glands start going off, you start getting these compensatory mechanisms where now the sympathetic nervous system is just buzzing up here, not because of the insult, but rather it's actually trying to recalibrate the adrenal gland function and other organ systems as a compensation for the organs themselves not working well. So by boosting the fatty acid oxidation through carnitine, by boosting the energy production, what I've seen is that naturally increases the adrenal glands and some of these organs in their state of functioning, which then allows the body to calm down. And sometimes just that triple, very simple combination is enough to just kind of settle things down. And then once we've got these kids, and they're my focus, in a stable enough place, then I can start the detoxification and get them going. And, where I was going with that poor little girl, that was, having these issues. I remember I started her at like maybe a milliliter of bentonite clay, which you would think is like a ridiculously small amount. And then the mom calls me, oh my God, she was doing better. Like she was tolerating clothes, and literally within 2 days, like everything went completely off the edge. Ultimately, the mom found that if she gave her literally, you laugh at this, 10 drops of bentonite clay, 10 drops of bentonite clay, things were cool. If 10 drops turned into 13 drops, literally everything would fall apart. And it was like most of the cases I deal with are kind of that extremely sensitive. And I found the more I can stabilize them, the faster I can move them through the detox and just get them better.
Do you find that many of these kids that they can get better, even still possibly being in a moldy environment at home or at school, like using these technologies and then using detoxification? Do you feel like you can get them to a place where they're functional and feeling pretty good?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the area to highlight is, as long as there isn't a significant amount of exposure, right? In the classroom, like I'm glad you brought that up. Like we know that there's lots of classrooms out there that sadly are very contaminated. But when there is enough control of that exposure, doesn't have to be perfect, but just good enough, I find that is a good place where we can then move things forward. And I mean, why I've become so attached to this is, I mean, the outcomes that we have had are like weird. Kids with intense sensory issues, intense anxiety, like that little girl, we're about 12 months, 9 to 12 months into her detox. And the mom sends me these messages where the same little girl that literally couldn't even go to school, and when she was in school, like just off the charts anxiety, big meltdowns, big issues, did a performance, literally, like, forget about tolerating all kinds of clothing and costumes. She was in front of the entire school at the performance, like performing in front of, I don't know, 100, 150 people. And literally the mom like sends me this message and she's crying. She's like, I can't believe she's doing this well. You know, other kids with other horrendous social anxiety where they can't even be in school, can't even leave the house, dramatically better. Learning disabilities where the kids are failing out of school, all of a sudden their entire executive functioning and working memory and all kinds of other cognitive states just dramatically improved, to the point where it's like you almost can't imagine these kinds of things being possible until you see it with your own eyes. And when you do, you're like, oh my God, like, one, how much harm is being caused? And two, how much good could we do? How many lives can we change if we just better understand this? And that's why, I mean, I was so happy to hear that you're doing this work. And, the second I was like, yep, count me in. I'm happy to do my part to just bring awareness. And thank you for doing this.
Yeah, of course. What do you find? So I want to back up because I have just a few different thoughts. One, so part of it is the parent listening to this whose child is got PANS or PANDAS or other neurological problems. There's hope, right? So, but finding a pediatrician is another part of the issue. Finding somebody who's mold literate as a doctor to help them. Could you talk about some of the different diagnostic tools that you use just to kind of come around to the thought of, okay, mold, we do suspect mold. We believe mold is at the core root or one of the core pieces of this puzzle.
Sure. There's a hell of a lot of debate, right, in the mold community in terms of what's the best diagnostic tool. There's the camp that urine testing is an accurate way to assess. And then there is the whole other camp that says absolutely not. Mold urine mycotoxin testing is completely inaccurate. So, we're still in our infancy in really understanding what are the best tools. My reservation with the urine mold toxin tests, the biggest reservation that I've developed over time is you can get a lot of false reads. I'll give you the example of false positives. I had a few cases where I looked at the test. I'm like, oh, for sure they have mold. For sure they have mold. Oh my God, look at these levels. There's for sure mold in their house. And parents are like, dude, I don't know what you're talking about. This house is like 3 years old. Our house is fine. And then in one case, the parents decided on their own to basically do some research, found foods that had mold toxins in them, cut the foods out, did another test. And then 4 weeks later, they sent in the test and they're like, hey, what do you think about this? And the follow-up test was completely clean. One of the things, and Dr. Andrew Campbell is one of the biggest kind of people who's raising this concern. Dr. Andrew Campbell, who owns a company that does mold toxin antibody testing, so he has a vested interest in this conversation, granted. His argument, along with Dr. Vojdani, is that urine mold toxin tests also pick up dietary mycotoxins. So whatever mycotoxin is making it into the body ultimately can show up in the urine. So you can get false positives depending on the diet. And if a family is doing, like my current protocol now is, if a family does a urine mycotoxin for at least a week before, they should nix pretty much all of the mold contaminated foods. So grains, corn, and dairy are the big ones, peanuts, another. The other thing that I've seen, especially in the kids, is I'd say about 20% of the time, depending on which lab you use, sometimes it's upwards of 40%, you can actually get a false negative. And I've had several cases that I've presented at different conferences, and I'm presenting again, where I looked at the urine test and I would swear that there wasn't a problem because it looked so benign. And long behold, like there was such heavy contamination in the environment that the family had to leave. And one of the things that we see is when certain individuals become so toxic, they actually lose the ability to detoxify. So they actually have difficulty pushing these toxins into the urine to then be detected by the technology. And that's where there are some methodological, technological problems with doing urine testing. So then that brings us to, well, if the urine testing is not 100% accurate, then what the heck is useful, right? And this is where also kind of to the dismay of some of my mold colleagues, I've started actually becoming more of a proponent for antibody testing. It's not to say the antibody testing is foolproof. There's still a lot of controversy around it for sure. But one of the things that I have seen as actually a pretty reliable measure is just checking for antibody reactions against the molds, specifically IgG. Because we know that the molds really do a good job in irritating the immune system, right? They're fantastic at irritating the immune system. And the IgG reactions, 80% of the time, there are times that they give false negatives, but 80% of the time they do actually correlate pretty well with actual exposure, active exposure to the molds. And the beauty of it is that for those that have insurance and a provider that can do blood work, you can actually check Cladosporium IgG and Penicillium IgG through Quest. So Quest Diagnostics actually has these as part of their panel. So as a screening, if people can't afford more expensive fancy labs, you can actually do that test through Quest. There's a company called Alletes, Allettes, I believe. They have mold panels. They have a basic mold panel, expanded mold panel that checks IgG, IgA, IgE. And then for those that want to get really fancy, for around $400, Dr. Campbell's lab, my Myco lab, actually checks for, I think it's IgG and IgA reactions against the mycotoxins themselves, which Dr. Campbell and others believe is the most accurate way to assess. So we have, all of this to say, we've got a hell of a lot more to learn. I'm curious to see what conversations have taken place and where you stand.
I lean more toward urinary, but with appropriate interpretation of the situation. So my practice is probably very different than yours in that when people come to see me, they're generally already grain-free, usually. So from the perspective of mycotoxins contaminating their food supply, it's not really as common because grain is the predominant source. All forms of grain, wheat, barley, rye, oats, corn, rice, sorghum, millet, etc., are very heavily mycotoxin contaminated. And so my background is gluten and gluten-free diet. So most people come to me and they're already following along with my book. And so I get a positive mycotoxin where they're, 5 times the level of tricotocin. I know it's probably not their diet. And so I can feel pretty comfortable about that. I used to use more of the IgG, IgA, IgE mold allergy, not mycotoxin allergy response, but mold allergy testing. I did a lot of that for several years. And what I found is almost everybody who was in mold had 70% or more IgG positive responses to the variety of different environmental molds that we know grow in homes, like Aspergillus, Penicillium, Cladosporium, Fusarium, Chitomium, et cetera, Stachy. So to me, it's a cost, right? Everything's a cost. And so for me, it was initially I would run several different batteries of things, and I would find that, okay, mycotoxins positive, they're not eating grain. 70 to 80% or more of their IgG responses to mold spores, so they're allergic to mold on top of it. And then, beyond that, we're looking at inflammatory markers and, and variable other things in the blood. And so there's correlation there that you can draw. And so for me, it's a battery of looking at all of those things kind of together. And if we find the suspicion of mold as being, usually, again, just my experience, if somebody's already grain-free and they're not responding and they're not getting better, and again, my practice is predominantly autoimmune disease, so it's not pediatric per se, but if their diet and lifestyle is dialed in and they're still reactive, mold is the first thing I suspect. And so if I get back a positive mycotoxin at that point, then to me, the false positive piece is probably not as likely. That's just kind of the way I view it. And then there's also, you probably looked at Shoemaker's stuff. And so a lot of, there are a lot of acolytes of his work, and the MSH and the variety or the sampling of different tests that don't really mean, like the TGF-beta-1 and that kind of stuff, that don't really mean you're in mold, but mean you're inflamed or mean you have an immunological response. So it's not specific per se to mold. Those I never really found to be all that helpful, because I would see people that had major gluten sensitivity issues where those same markers would be abnormal. And when we changed their diet, they would normalize. So again, my experience just coming from a gluten background, seeing those types of labs normalize with a change in diet, and whether their change in diet was the fact that they were gluten sensitive, went gluten free, and the immune system calmed down, or whether they were eating a lot of grain and there were mycotoxins and mold in the grain, don't know. Haven't done the research to fine tooth that out. But I like urine as a general tool based on the type and the style of practice that I have and the type of people that I see.
Got it. And I'm sure that I've talked to Dr. Nathan about this too. The pediatric population is also, they're different. Their physiologies are different, right? And one of the things that I am becoming more questioning of is how a child's ability to clear toxins differs from that of an adult. And that has been one of the kind of, underlying tenets that have driven me, because I do think there are differences in these kids in ultimately how they present, how they're affected than even some of the adults.
Are you looking at any kind of genetic predisposition markers that might help you understand better how their metabolic detoxification pathways are working? So like certain genetic tests. I know I have some neighbors who are pediatricians who like to do a lot of genetic testing for that kind of thing with their PANS and PANDAS patients. But I just curious about what you think about that.
I've drifted away from the genetics, because ultimately what I find is if the kid has already gotten sick, clearly they had the vulnerability, right? So to try to assess the vulnerability in the kid that is clearly vulnerable and already sick doesn't really change that much in terms of what we need to do. what constitutionally, what I have seen over and over again is the highly sensitive, highly intelligent kids are typically the ones who are most vulnerable to the mycotoxins, at least in how they ultimately come to present with PANS and PANDAS and even some of the learning issues. It's a weird thing, and I've never actually done genetics just on them to see where, you know, their genetic vulnerabilities lay. But constitutionally speaking, those are the kids that I've become, you know, I've seen that link with. As time has passed, I think like you, I've started going more and more into what is the most efficient, least expensive way that I can help these people. And, you know, while there's no question that genetics could be helpful and they can give information in terms of where some of the specific pathway abnormalities come, what I also have found is literally by just doing some simple things, like 90% of the kids get dramatically better. And those simple things are control enough of the environment where, you know, the onslaught of the mycotoxin mold spore exposure is stopped, calm down their systems, metabolically boost the kids that show they need it. And you know, for me, I don't even at this stage need organic acid tests or genetic tests to look at a kid, because you see there are kids that even with the mycotoxins, they're robust. They'll run for 2 hours and play soccer on a soccer field and it doesn't faze them. And then there are the kids that are not. And the kids that are exhausted, the kids that are chronically low tone, the kids that try to play soccer, but after 15 minutes sit literally in the middle of the soccer field and can't move. Like for me, I've really tried to push myself to get as much data as possible from the family and child without having to resort to expensive tests to tell us what we can essentially see. And that's the beauty of kids. Like they just share everything, right? You can see everything in them once you start learning how to see it. And in these kids, then it's like, well, clearly there is a metabolic disruption. So carnitine, metabolic cocktails, mitochondrial cocktails to boost metabolic functioning. These kids do really, really well with that. In some of these children, I'll use, you know, other compounds like pyroquinolone, quinine to further stabilize the mitochondria, sometimes bigger doses of CoQ10. And, you know, once some of those basic fundamental things are there, then moving into the detox and just clearing these mycotoxins out is all these kids need. So I'm trying to really bring myself to a place of less is more, just to be mindful of the financial burden I place on these families' plate to ultimately get the kids better.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely, especially with mold. I mean, especially with mold. I mean, how many people have you seen that move out of their house, go through the cost of that expense, or go through the cost of remediation, go through the cost of buying new clothes, new mattresses, new furniture, after remediation, and then you throw on the cost of treatment and everything else. It just can become, you know, a big burden financially, no doubt. What so you find that, you know, through certain types of tests can give you good insight, certain types of approaches toward improving or accelerating their metabolic function, their mitochondrial function, gets them to a place where they're capable of, you know, beginning a detoxification process without, you know, major negative side effects. And then beyond that, are there other things that you recommend generally for people that have been mold exposed? I mean, you mentioned, you know, avoiding, you know, certain foods, you know, to do a mycotoxin test, but do you put in place like a food restrictive diet based on any type of testing, or do you just simply, you know, say, let's avoid foods that are high mold, high mycotoxin as a general rule? What kind of things are you doing in that regard?
So in my dream world, the families will be following your suggestions. I think a very low grain, clean, low inflammatory diet, low mycotoxin diet is what I would love. The reality is most of the kids can't handle that. So the majority of the children that I serve have weird sensory issues where literally their entire nervous system's orientation to sensory experience is altered. And this extends into, outside of sound and balance and so forth, it extends into their sense of smell and also experience of textures. So the older kids that can articulate, several of them have told me, like, food just tastes gross in my mouth. When my mom tells me to eat salmon, like, salmon feels disgusting. And literally what I find is, one, the appetite centers are off. So a lot of these kids, when you look at their eating patterns, they graze, they nibble on stuff throughout the day. But outside of the change in appetite, their sensory experience of food is actually altered. So the way they experience food is, to most normal people, enjoyable, right? You eat a delicious, steak or salmon, it's pleasurable. For these kids, the density of the textures, the sliminess of some of the foods is so overwhelming that they literally can't tolerate the experience of the food. So it's not just that the food is not pleasurable, or it's not just that the food is not pleasurable. It's actually a adverse experience for them that they would prefer to avoid. So one of the things that I try to be very mindful of is, 6 years ago, it was like, well, every kid needs to just be gluten-free, dairy-free, low grain, low this, low that. And I just realized, like, that's an impossible ask for these families, because either I end up forcing a fight between the parent and the child, which causes more stress in the family, or at times they just give up because what I'm asking is impossible. What I do find as a starting point is, if the families just go after the high histamine foods, sometimes it's surprising. Like, I didn't know that avocados, for instance, can trigger histamine. I've had so many families where, it's like bone broth, give bone broth because bone broth fixes your kid's diet, or it fixes your kid's gut, right? It increases the mucosal layer. It does all of these wonderful things, except bone broth and sauerkraut and fermented foods are some of the highest histamine foods around. And I had some cases where kid was doing great. Everything was going fine. And then all of a sudden call comes in. My kid is an absolute disaster. I don't know what's going on. So and then you dig. Yeah. So I started giving her some bone broth because I wanted her gut to get better. So the one thing that I've started doing with the diet is first just getting rid of all processed foods, sugars, food colorings in particular, where they're a big disaster for these kids. And then along with that, at least the very, very high histamine foods. And usually that's enough to, along with the enzymes, to just ground the histamine levels. And the really interesting thing when this happens, and this may be applicable to some of the adults out there, their nervous systems calm down and those sensory issues calm down. So I've had some moms that have done this with their kids, and the mom's like, oh my God, I'm getting less anxious in these environments, because auditory sensitivity is part of this process. And there are moms that have come in and they're like, wow, I don't get so stressed out when I go to parties or when I go outside, because it's not so overwhelming to me. So as I modulate this histamine reaction, which then modulates the sensory issues, a lot of times, naturally, these kids start becoming more open to eating. And now the kid takes their first bite of salmon. And now the kid takes their first bite of chicken or vegetables, broccoli. The kid that hasn't touched the vegetable in their, last 3 years of life suddenly took a bite of broccoli and didn't mind it. And as we slowly open them up to being able to eat other foods, that's when I tell the parents, like, okay, now they're eating these other foods. Now we're not in this, box. Start getting rid of the gluten. Start getting rid of some of the, more inflammatory grains like corn. Let's dial down the dairy. And slowly what we do is we put the focus on these healthy foods. We get rid of these pro-inflammatory foods, which then gets us further along the process of healing.
What you're describing to me almost kind of rings of the fibromyalgia community, where their pain is a sensory processing issue. more than it is like a traumatic damage to the muscle or nerve fibers directly. And what you're saying with these kids is there's a sensory processing issue that if you can reduce their histamine, which is it's a neuroactive compound, you can relieve their nervous system to a certain extent where they'll start opening up to other things. We see a lot of that with fibromyalgia and mold. And that's what's interesting there. I'm sure you've read the work on chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and mycotoxicosis. I can't remember which study it was. Something, don't quote me on this, is something like 90% of people that had those prior diagnoses actually had super high levels of mycotoxins when measured.
It's wild. It's wild. And what you're bringing up is I love learning from other disciplines. Like half the things that I've integrated into the work that I do for these kids literally is from non-pediatric, practitioners or books. I'll read something on, half the things that I do for some of these kids with PANS and PANDAS actually came from, some of the experts in chronic fatigue syndrome. And as I looked, I'm like, oh, I think that could be helpful for the kids. Let me try it. Like the pyroquinolone, there was one or two people in the world of chronic fatigue and mitochondria that started talking about that. And in some of my kids, like it's literally a game changer. Like the kids just come to life, literally within a week or two of using this. So I love learning just from these other conversations and domains because everything is applicable. It's just a matter of figuring out how to tie it in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need more of that in the world. More doctors coming together and brainstorming root cause versus brainstorming, symptomatic regression through pharmaceutical. But I'm going to go backwards in this conversation because I think one of the things that would benefit anyone watching this is maybe they're sitting at home and they're thinking, do I have mold? So, and maybe they're struggling in some ways. What are some of the biggest, more common symptoms that you see in your pediatric population of mold? What triggers in your mind when you're doing a follow-up or doing an exam, this person has mold?
So good question. It's not always that's the thing that's so tricky about mold. It doesn't always present in the same way. I've had kids, the vast majority of the kids in my practice who have had severe asthma, like we're talking, they're on inhaled steroids and still ending up in the emergency department. Every single one of them had mold exposure. Bad cases of eczema, like not one or two tiny patches. We're talking like quarter of the child's body is exposed, affected by eczema, scratching themselves to the point of bleeding eczema. Those were all mold. Severe allergies, those kids that are just chronically congested, mouth breathing, end up with gigantic tonsils, end up needing tonsillectomy. A lot of those kids had mold. Beyond that, there's kind of this fatigability / nervous system disorientation is probably the thing that I'm most sensitive to. The kids that their systems are just off and you can't really put your finger on it, but they're too agitated. They can't regulate. The kids that are hyperactive, and it's not just a little bit of hyperactivity. The kids that just cannot sit still for dinner. They're in the classroom. They're being disruptive, having weird impulsive reactions that would classify as ADHD. Those kids are the ones that perk up my ears. Failure to thrive is a really, really big one. As the more I've talked to other pediatric mold practitioners, like all of us are on the same boat that, severe failure to thrive. I'm not talking the kid that's kind of a little too small. We're talking the 6-year-old that looks like a 3-year-old. They're in the 1st percentile, 5th percentile of growth. At least in everyone that I've talked to, all of us agree that that's probably mold exposure. And all the failure to thrive kids that I have in my practice, literally every single one of them have mold exposure. gastrointestinal issues. So the kids who have gastrointestinal issues that just do not get better, like they're kids, you get rid of gluten, you get rid of dairy, you put them on a probiotic, voila, everything is just honky-dory, and bowel movements are normal, everything is normal, no problem, right? Like you said earlier on, that the individuals where you do that and you've done the probiotics, you've done the gut protocol, and everything is still a big hot mess, those kids all, at least in my experience, have had mold exposure. And along with that, the individuals who have 15,000 food sensitivities, or if they're essentially allergic to the entire world, right? There are more things they're allergic to than they're not. Those individuals I find are also exposed. So there are a cluster of symptoms, and I think based on the child's constitution and genetics, some kids veer more into the allergy domain, some kids veer more into the nervous system domain, other kids with growth problems and other things similar to that.
Yeah, that's an interesting cluster. I again, you're pediatrics and I'm more adults, not less pediatrics, but for me, it's most of it is neurological. Chronic fatigue, fibromyalgic, processing problems with the nervous system. So, their brains don't work. They can't think of the word. When my wife and I were in mold, I had to finish her sentences. Mm-hmm. She was so slow cognitively that it was, it created a problem for our ability to communicate with each other. And that was one of the hallmarks of how we kind of figured it out was she was so tired and just couldn't recall the words. I mean, her brain was just so foggy. But then we also have the cluster of people whose GI tracts won't respond no matter what you do. And I personally believe it's mycotoxin disruption of the microbiome and creating changes in bacteria that break down histamine. And so then the histamine from the food becomes more toxic to those individuals. I mean, I've seen that a number of times where we look at microbiome analysis and see their ability to, or their levels of bifido and lactobacillus, which are histamine degrading probiotics, are on the floor. They just don't exist. And, I don't know if you've seen that same kind of thing, if you do any kind of microbiome testing with kiddos, but that's just been something that we've seen. So when the irony being that, like you said earlier, with the sauerkraut or the certain probiotics that you try to give them, they have a histamine response to. And so the irony is that even though they're low, they can't tolerate the things that you want to give them to get the correction.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually got to a place where I stopped doing stool studies because just about every single one of my patients had an abnormal stool study. And I've just come to a place where I pretty much presume that every single child that I take care of has a microbiome abnormality because it's just that common. The thing that I've, at least in the kids, become really concerned about is fungal overgrowth with, possible colonization of the molds. Because especially in the little kids, what I find is if a child is born into a moldy environment or lives in a moldy environment in those first, let's say 4 to 5 years of life, because especially early on, they haven't yet really matured their microbiome, their ability to actually resist fungal overgrowth or colonization, because we end up swallowing these mold spores, right? If it's in the environment, ultimately it's getting into our gastrointestinal tract. It really seems that for these kids that I take care of, a lot of them end up getting colonized. And because they have the microbiome disruptions, they end up getting fairly aggressive levels of candidal overgrowth. So what I end up having to do in these kids is, on top of trying to restore the microbiome, use various things, whether it's pharmaceuticals or herbal combinations, to actually knock down the fungal mold problem to allow the rest of the microbiome to actually normalize.
Yeah, I see the same thing in adults. There's a lot of candida and rhodotorula and geotrichum overgrowth that. And again, when their environment is moldy. it's interesting how much overlap that there is, isn't it?
Yeah. It really is. It really is.
What's your when you take on a mold case or suspect mold and kind of confirm it? What's the timeline? I know it's hard to answer this question definitively, but I'm sure a lot of parents are thinking, does it take 6 months to see a change or an improvement? Does it take a year? What is a typical timeline or typical outcome that you might see if all things are working great?
So I set the expectation for the families to, be prepared for a year to a year and a half of work. And the reason why I do that is I find to really decolonize and really clean up the system, that's not an overnight process. And, early on, I thought 3 months of, charcoal and clay and a little bit of antifungal, magically everything's going to be better. And I was rudely awakened to how misled I was, or how confused I was, because Dr. Nathan had taught us that that's not the case. With that said, I find that, even within a few weeks, once we control enough of the environment and just do some basic inflammatory controls, the kids get sometimes dramatically better. So at least at a symptomatic level, the kids are calmer. I've had kids with, expressive language delays, with, other cognitive changes, sometimes even with a few basic things, just addressing some of the pro-inflammatory foods, bringing in a few, compounds to stabilize the system. They're better. And the parents are tickled to death because the PANS and PANDAS symptoms are down by 50%, hyperactivity is down, whatever else. What I've also learned over time, and I had some families that were they were so happy with how well things were going that they just skipped the detox, did the supplements, and then at some point, 6 months or a year later, they're back because they're like, oh my God, my kid is a big mess. And that is where the true work comes in. So while symptoms may be better, which is the perfect time to do the detox, what I've also learned is until you really clean things up and you remove the colonization and get these mycotoxin levels down, you're still kind of in this fragile state where COVID, some kind of other exposure, strep, whatever the case may be, anything that can show up could be enough to just completely tip the system over, and then you're back at square one. So that's why I set the expectation, just be prepared for this marathon to last, at least 12 months. And I do my best to try to calm the initial symptomologic issues down as quickly as possible, to then allow us to do the more important work of actually cleaning up the system. The one thing that has been really cool, and I mean, this is the part that I love about the work that I do, is the changes that we see in these kids sometimes is just so crazy, where I'll give you a few, an example. I've had a few kids where, like I said, their executive functioning was just completely shot. These kids could not do schoolwork for the life of them. And then along with that, weird processing issues, short-term memory, ability to learn and process math, almost non-existent. Handwriting was a complete mess because their fine motor skills, which is tied to, other sensory pathways, was a mess. And then we do the detox, and especially as the mycotoxin levels came down, and I'm sure you saw this, with your wife, and this is more of a personal experience for you. What I've seen in a lot of these kids is all of a sudden, there's a level of intelligence that just keeps showing up, and all of a sudden, the parents are like, yeah, I don't even have to tell her to do the schoolwork. She just comes in and she just finishes it. And I haven't had to remind her to do schoolwork for the last month. And the kids that couldn't learn math are now killing it at math. Handwriting suddenly improves, the way they're able to process information. Kids that needed a one-on-one tutor because they were failing suddenly are in a regular classroom, and they're the top student, and half the time they don't even need reminders of what they learned because they're just catching everything. And I think for me, what's so exciting about this conversation is not how doom and gloom and awful and oh my God, how bad all of this is, which it is. You know, there's a lot of people that are being harmed. There's a lot of suffering and disability that's taking place. But for me, the golden lining in this conversation is there's so much good that we can do. There's so much health that we can bring. And especially for the kids, and this is the part that touches my heart the most, is these changes that we induce are not like a 1 or 2 day thing. Like literally, it's a hard rewiring of their system where permanently the ability of these children to learn and function and process is permanently changed. And like why I'm here, why I'm so excited to be doing this work and to be here sharing this information is, I mean, essentially for these kids, we're able to rewrite their entire future. And the kids that called themselves dumb and stupid, and it's sad how many kids are feeling that way because of the mycotoxicity. And the kids who, you know, label themselves as bad, and I've had 10, 20 kids in my practice that literally stared at me in the face like, do you think I'm bad? Do you think I'm evil? Change and become literally a different person, a pleasant person, a kind person, a loving person. And I think why this conversation is so important, when you look into the literature, and for instance, you look into the literature of this thing we call oppositional defiant disorder, which is basically these kids that just explode and they're oppositional and they defy everything. And we just say, well, it's, you know, 500,000 kids in this country just have ODD. Like that actually means something, because I don't think kids are inherently bad. I do not believe that kids want to inherently be a problem. You know, kids by their nature are loving. Kids by their nature are kind. Kids by their nature want to belong and want to be good. And the sad thing is, like, for instance, the literature says that kids, 6 to 8 year olds that have oppositional defiant disorder, their likelihood of incarceration is about 300% of the normal population. Kids who have ADHD, more severe cases of ADHD, their likelihood of dropping out of school and ultimately not going to college and basically failing out of school is 300% of the norm. And then these kids go on to get into trouble and ultimately get in trouble with the law. Why? Because they never feel good. They can't control themselves. They come to see themselves as a stupid human being that, you know, sadly, you know, is worthless. And when you can't learn and you can't function and everyone's constantly telling you to behave and control yourself, except it's not you, you know, it's a possession of these mycotoxins. You start giving up on yourself. You start giving up on life. You start giving up on the world because everything is too hard. And then it wouldn't be a surprise that these kids go on to do not good things that end up getting them in trouble. And I think why this conversation is so important and why I'm so grateful that you're doing this is we can change this and we can help these kids have a bright and beautiful and healthy future if we can just understand how these things are coming together to impact them. So,
yeah, beautifully said. I mean, these kids are our future. And the rates are not going down, they're going up. What do you feel like is the biggest hurdle to getting this word out and helping people become aware? Because, I mean, you've probably seen this, a lot of people, you mention mold and their eyes roll, like you can hear their eyes roll, it's so loud. Or you mention mold and they don't understand it. And so they ignore it. They ignore it as a potential possibility and just go on, and they incur massive suffering for years and years and years as a result of just not wanting to face that as a potential problem. Do you find that there have been certain ways of communication, or even again, going back to diagnostic testing, is there something that you have found that patternistically helps people who are in mold realize that it's actually a problem and helps them take the greater degrees of action as opposed to dismissing it as, you know, and getting a second opinion?
I've definitely run into those scenarios. And I mean, even within our circle of friends, so immediate circle of friends, there's one physician who, poo-hoos it. And like to my face, he's like, oh, none of that stuff is real. This is all, just nonsense. I think we're so early in this domain, and I don't try to take any of this personally, because I think it's just kind of the nature of where things are, and there was a time where people couldn't imagine cigarette smoking was a problem, right? And if you said like, oh, that's not healthy for you, they're like, oh, come on, and then you see pediatricians on, advertisements, smoking, right? I think we have a while to go, and there will be those who are ready, and there will be those who are wanting to find the solution, the alternative, the root cause of the issue. And there'll be those that are not yet ready, and they're fine with doing whatever symptomatic treatment to address whatever issue that they're having. One of the things that, I see, and others have pointed out wisely, is because we're so early into this, there's still such a paucity of data, right? We don't have lots of, especially clinical studies. We have a lot of scientific studies, right? We know that the mycotoxins disrupt the microbiome. We know they disrupt, hormone production. Like we have that scientific core data, but when it comes to human disease, such as the autism link, for instance, like there's 20 published, maybe 25 published studies in total looking at that link. When it comes to PANS and PANDAS, there's essentially none. So I think we have a long way to go to really start having the hardcore clinical data, which would then help the actual medical community start turning around and say, oh gosh, this is really real. And then we have the early adopters that are willing to kind of come on this bandwagon because they see what's happening, right? And it doesn't make sense. PANS and PANDAS, it doesn't make sense. The severe, cases of anxiety, at least in these kids, the learning disabilities, like when you really ask, like, what the hell is causing this? There's no answer. There's radio silence. And like for me, one of the things that I try to do to help these families come on board is for those that are on the fence, I'll give them that triple combination. Take some carnitine, take some Miraca, take some histamine block, give it 2 weeks, and presuming there isn't horrific contamination. Sometimes, at least in these children with, hyperactivity and sensory issues and anxiety, there's enough improvement to the point where the parents like come back and they say, well, I don't know what the hell you just did, but I can actually see my kid is now calmer and she's not flipping out of her head as often as she used to, or Johnny is now finally sitting down for the first time, and even Ritalin and Adderall couldn't do this. And sometimes by just doing that, I get the attention of these families for them to then say, oh gosh, okay, this is real. What's next? And I think the more conversations we have, right, and the more wonderful people like you help get these messages out there, the more we can bring awareness, which will then drive, hopefully more research and more work to really get this into the masses.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's like, it reminds me a lot of gluten 20 plus years ago. Today gluten's a household word. 20 years ago, everybody kind of scorned the term, right? Celiac disease, less than 1%, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I really greatly appreciate your expertise and your willingness to share, and just been a fantastic conversation. Where can we send people if they want to learn more about the work you're doing and learn more about your clinic and how you can help children with PANS and PANDAS?
So, I mean, my clinic practice is called Wholistic Kids with a W. My goal right now is really to do more. I find that there's way too many kids out there who are suffering, and for me to try to be the one person who helps them is just not enough. So part of what I've done is, one, I've actually started a mentorship program to really empower other providers, really smart, competent providers to do this work. And to really augment that, part of what we're doing is actually, we're in the process of building a AI tool, a digital platform that helps providers do their great work with greater ease and efficiency. And this portal is called Wholistic Minds. So WHOLISTICMINDS. And within the next few months, our first group of providers will actually be able to help families through this portal to really start getting this work out in a much larger fashion. And one of the reasons why I built this portal is I look at the scale of suffering and disease and so many people that are stuck in states of unhealth. And I've realized there has to be a lot more that we can do. And when we look at how functional medicine and holistic medicine is being done right now, just like with you, I'm sure, like, I spend an hour digging into the information and asking a million questions and really trying to understand what's happening. And one of the epiphanies that I've had is, well, technology can do a lot of that for us. So as providers, instead of spending 45 minutes to gather all the information, if technology gathers the information, even highlights the most important pieces, as a provider, we can spend more time on the healing aspect and on the highly, complicated, sophisticated decision-making, rather than asking the same question for the 1,000th time to the 1,000th patient. So that's really one of the most important things of Wholistic Minds, to not just empower providers to be able to see what they don't yet know how to see, but to also allow them to be more efficient. So one, they don't get burnt out. Two, they're able to help more people, which brings down the cost of care. And through this, we can ultimately make this type of care more accessible to more people. And that's Wholistic Minds.
Wholistic Minds, fantastic. Well, this has, again, been an amazing conversation. Thank you again. I'd love to dive in more, maybe when you have your Wholistic Minds fully up and running. That seems to me like a great endeavor for doctors to use as a tool. It sounds like a tool that physicians are going to be able to use to garner information about patients and help make better, quicker decisions and have less waiting time to get in to see different doctors, but still be able to have accurate data. Is that the gist of it?
Yeah. And we're actually, so the basic system is up. The provider portal is actually undergoing testing now, and we should have the final release in the next 6 to 8 weeks. Because it's exactly that, to help providers just be better, smarter, more efficient, which would then allow a lot more people to get in and to get this kind of care. Because we have a few thousand holistic providers, and we have millions upon millions of Americans. Forget about the rest of the world who doesn't even have access to this. There are too many people who need this type of care, and there's too few providers that are able to do the work. And we have to use technology to change that. And that's what we're working to do. Excellent.
Well, it was so nice to meet you. So nice to chat with you. Look forward to maybe running into you again in the future and having some more in-depth conversations about your experiences as you grow and as I grow together.
It will be a delight. It would be a delight. Happy to be here. And again, thank you for the work you're doing. It's so important. And I'm so grateful for all the hard work you're putting in to make this happen.
Yeah, you're welcome. And likewise.
Thank you.
All right. Well, you have a wonderful day, and
you too.
Hopefully we'll talk sooner rather than later.
Sounds good. Sounds really good.
Okay. Bye for now.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this, and make sure you come back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and Thursday at noon 30 for more episodes.